Well, hello to our patrons, and I've got some of the latest questions that we've been asked, and I'll go through them. So, Declan Buchanan, who's asked a number of questions, so we've just picked one to answer. How much did it cost to manufacture a Mark IV at the time of the war? So we're talking about a First World War tank here. Our evidence is they're about £5,000. It's a bit tricky trying to do comparisons, but we reckon in modern parlance, probably coming on for £250,000. So that's quite a bit of money, as you can imagine. We know that the international tank, we've got a firm figure for that, which is just over £8,000, and that was in 1918. So you get some sort of idea of what they're paying at the time. But as with many of these things, you can do modern comparisons with the money, but not everything has gone forward with the same rate of inflation, so it's hard. But we reckon in World War I, a modern British Mark IV tank of the time, about 5,000 guineas or £5,000, and that we think is about £250,000. Interceptor 57. What's the current status on our A30 Challenger and Mark I Dingo? These are two vehicles. If you don't know, the A30 Challenger was a bodge vehicle done in World War II for the British, has a massive slab-sided turret to squeeze in the 17-pounder gun. And the Challenger, there's only two of them left. We have one that came off of a firing range. That firing range was actually a salt marsh, and for the decades the tank was sitting there on this salt marsh. Unfortunately, it got very, very rusty. And when we went to move it, not that many years ago, massive sheets delaminated from the hull almost to the point of the vehicle collapsing. There is a second A30 over in Holland at the Overloon Museum. That's the only two that are left. Now, being the British Tank Museum, that is part of the World War II British tank story. Not that many were made, but it was our way of trying to get the 17-pounder into a vehicle. We then, of course, realised we could get it into the Firefly or the Sherman, and that kind of answered some of the problem of being able to get our most powerful anti-tank gun at the time into a tank. So what are we going to do with our A30? At the moment, it's not even in this building I'm in at the moment, which is our Vehicle Conservation Centre. It's still in one of our backroom stores, and we are looking at what we're going to restore for our revamped World War II hall. My gut feeling at the moment is the A30 is such a long-term project. Firstly, we've got to wait till our new workshops are built and we're up and fully running there. Then we've got to work out how much resource we can put into it. Do we just try and cosmetically restore it? Do we make it structurally sound? Is it probably only going to be a static for the museum? But yes, we certainly want to do something with the A30 Challenger. When that's going to be at this moment in time, still very hard to say. The Mark I Dingo, we've had a couple of false starts on that. For those, again, who don't know, we've probably got the last remaining Mark I Dingo in existence. Dingo, the Mark Is, they're the ones that went to France in 1940. They had four-wheel steering that was later converted because they could get into certain types of lock if you weren't driving them properly. They tended to have an armoured roof as well, which the later Dingos didn't tend to have. Our Mark I, we think it's a great vehicle to restore. We've got most of the parts. We're going to be looking for one or two smaller parts that were missing, and that's something we might use things like our Facebook, YouTube, etc. to appeal for, because we've got the guy out there who's restored dingoes over most of his life. He knows all about the dingo, and we'd really like him to restore our Mark I. It's an important British vehicle. There is that little bit of a tendency, we denigrate World War II British armour. The Dingo was a superb bit of engineering that did exactly as it said on the tin, and was a really, really effective vehicle. You'll see photos sometimes of the Germans captured a Dingo, they put it back into service and used it. It was an excellent, speedy, fast reconnaissance liaison vehicle. So fingers crossed about the Mark I. I hope we can give you much more positive information, hopefully fairly soon. Maybe within the next year we'll let you know how that's going to develop and what we're going to be doing about it. So some other questions. Robert Sanchez, I was asked, acknowledging that World War II armour is a popular subject, Does the museum ever come under criticism for highlighting the Nazi war machine? Do you offer information in your exhibits to remind visitors of the awful ideals that the German impressive armour fought for? Do you feel that that is a role for your museum? It's an interesting question because we feel very, very strongly about this. We are the British Tank Museum. We are here. The reason we're there is to tell the story about Royal Armoured Corps, the British soldiers that fought in tanks, the Royal Tank Regiment, one of the particular regiments that fought in tanks. That's whose museum we are. And it's very clear in why we're put together as a charity, the collection we have put together and the stories we are bound to tell inevitably touch on 20th century history in a way that is well more than just talking about the technical history. And I'm always slightly hurt but at the same time fascinated why we'll put something like a tank chat up. The fact we mention something about the war, many people really enjoy that because it's putting the vehicle in more of a context. Just occasionally we sometimes get an email that's sort of saying, look, stop telling me all about this bad stuff about the Nazis, just let me enjoy the tank. Now for us, separating the two is impossible to do. These are weapons of war. Some of them have got an amazing history in that period of warfare, some of them in times of peace as well. For us to ignore that side of things, we just would not be doing our job. And obviously when you're talking about issues as sensitive as the Second World War, the Nazi Party, the defeat of fascism, just looking at that bit of kit as if it's a wonderful piece of engineering, to me, you're just missing the point. You know, it was done for a certain reason. At a certain point in time, all of that background engineering, all of the science, all of the people that were there to manufacture, etc., we need to look at that whole picture, not a specific part of it. And certainly, I personally am very conscious, and I think we at the Tank Museum are very conscious that we don't get to the point where we only look at these things as some form of 20th century achievement in engineering, not what they were used for and who they were used by. And again, I'd encourage people, have a look on things like TripAdvisor, look at people who have visited the museum and what they're saying about it. We're very conscious. We never want people to walk away thinking somehow we're glorifying the subject or we're belittling the human engagement or the human cost. And certainly if you're looking at the 20th century, our story about the defeat of fascist Germany is bloody important for us to get across, and there's a morality to that story as well which we would be entirely ignoring if we didn't talk about the human factor, who was behind it, what was going on, that bigger picture. And so thank you for that question. It's really important to us, and I'll be very fascinated if everyone ever comes back to us and says, hang on a second, I think you're overdoing this one. The people I get angry with is where it's almost like you're interrupting my wonderful hobby by talking about nasty things like the Nazis. You know, sorry mate, they come as a package. Here we go again, another one, Interceptor 57. Is the Ordnance quick-firing 75mm gun equipped on later British tanks simply a rebored 6-pounder with some detailed changes to the breech, or was the barrel taken from the American 75mm gun and placed onto a 6-pounder breech ring assembly? Now it sounds a bit of a nerdy question, but it's quite an important one. When the Americans turned up with their 75mm gun on the original M4 Sherman, that gun, the British loved it because it could fire an effective high explosive round and a good quality armour piercing round. So it was a genuine dual purpose gun. The British tanks with the 2-pounder and the 6-pounder, both of those guns had been designed as an anti-tank gun. So they fire either solid shot or solid shot with a small bursting charge to knock out other bits of armour. They weren't intended to fire high explosives at infantry formations, buildings, artillery positions, etc. That wasn't their role. So, of course, the British really like the 75mm the Americans come up with, and we think that's a great one. You know, the 6-pounder gun just does not have an effective high explosive till later in the war, and even then it's certainly not as good as the American 75mm. So in Italy, they actually converted about 200 Churchill tanks. They took the 75mm gun off either redundant Shermans or knocked out Shermans and put them onto the turrets of Churchill tanks because that's how good they thought that gun was and how useful it was, being able to fire both the armour piercing and high explosive. They called those Churchill 75 NAs, North African, we think the NA stands for. So at the same time then, the British Ordnance Factory starts looking at, can we make our own version of the 75mm gun? And what they're thinking is, the Americans are making all this ammunition, high explosive armour piercing, for their gun. Wouldn't it be a good idea, as the cartridge sizes are very similar, we do something like a 75mm that we can put on our tanks as well? And that's exactly what they do. They get as many components, part of the design brief, as many components from the 6-pounder as you can. They rebore the 6-pounder barrel before they start manufacturing some 6-pounder barrels, into 75mm guns. And it looks pretty much the same as the 6-pounder, but the actual cartridge is now taking exactly the same ammunition as the American 75mm, the one we normally see on the bog standard Shermans. So that means we've got this dual purpose gun. We put them on the Cromwell, we put them on some models of the Churchill, the late model of the Valentine, and it gives that great dual purpose. The problem we have is then in Northwest Europe, we're realising actually the 6-pounder, especially later in 44, we're coming up with discarding sabot ammunition. The penetration of that 6-pounder gun is seen by the crews to be much more important than the high explosive capacity they thought they liked when they're out in Italy or North Africa. So that means that we end up converting some tanks back, or later in the production runs, we're starting to put 6-pounder guns back on tanks. For most of the time though, the 17-pounder and the quick-firing 77mm that we put on the Comet tank, really it's a shortened 17-pounder, that actually meets the anti-armour problem of later on British tanks in Northwest Europe. But yes, the British 75mm, it's an improvisation, but it sort of works, and it's a very sensible improvisation because it means we can tap into the ammunition production of this massive industrial might of America. So those guns can fire the standard round, which again, very useful from that point of view. And finally, I've got a question here from Joshua Lawrence saying, do I, that's me, have a favourite vehicle in the museum's collection, and what is particularly special about it for you? This one's always been a tricky one. Someone else has asked me this before. No, honest answer is I don't have a particular favourite vehicle. One of the things that I love about this collection is we've got so many interesting vehicles. Sometimes we've got a vehicle with a great story behind it that we're finding out more. We've met people sometimes who've actually served in our vehicle we've got here. They tell us little details, they show us a bit more evidence. We find out more because letters or records come in. So suddenly a vehicle that seems a bit insignificant, we build up a better picture about it, a better story. So all of that to me makes all of them pretty interesting. I'm bound to have a little bit more of a bias for the British vehicles because terrible tendency, we all get excited about the big German stuff. I've mentioned that earlier about this sort of sexy nature that everyone seems to give the German vehicles. I'd love to see that balance go back again, a bit more interest in some of those British vehicles and the Commonwealth effort as well. You know, there's a lot of other vehicles there that really deserve a mention, deserve having a look at. So if I was honest, we've got amazing stuff here. You know, if I could grab one vehicle and somehow put it under my arm in a fire, you know, the fact we got Little Willie, what an amazing vehicle to survive all that time. But there's so many other vehicles here that have got a great story to them. And that for me, yes, there's rarities, yes, there's things that people turn up from all over the world to see, but the whole collection as a whole, you know, that's the thing that gives you a buzz. There's so much here, not one little thing turns me on, the whole lot does as overall. So I hope that answers some of the patrons' questions this time. Do keep sending them in. We've got some other questions there floating around. We'll try and answer them. But again, you know, and there's other bits of the museum you might like to have a look at as well. So we can answer some questions. At the moment, we're in our Vehicle Conservation Centre. If you overhear some sounds in the background, it's because we're starting building work on our new workshop. So that'll be another interesting thing to see over the next 6 months, where we're putting together 6 bays, crane, all sorts of interesting things so that we can do more of the conservation and restoration on all these vehicles that are sitting behind me here in our conservation centre. So thank you very much again for supporting us, and keep the questions coming.